What would you do if you discovered that the quaint farmhouse you purchased at auction concealed a century-old horror beneath its weathered floorboards? What if the strange saltiness of your well water and the inexplicable preservation of certain objects on your property were not coincidental, but warnings of something far more sinister that local residents had tried to forget? In the early spring of 1903, as Kentucky's bluegrass was just beginning to peek through the thawing soil, a discovery in the small community of Blackford Creek would unearth a case so disturbing that county officials initially attempted to suppress its details from spreading beyond the jurisdiction of Henderson County. The macabre finding beneath the Willow Creek farm, once owned by the respected Caldwell family, would later be recognized as one of the most bizarre criminal cases in Kentucky's history. Yet many details remain conspicuously absent from official records to this day. March 20th, 1903. The skies over Henderson County hung heavy with rain clouds as Timothy Fletcher, a 32-year-old tenant farmer, began the laborious process of preparing the recently purchased Caldwell property for spring planting. Fletcher, who had acquired the abandoned farm at a county auction 3 months prior for a suspiciously low sum, had delayed renovations on the dilapidated barn due to the unusually harsh winter. With the first true break in the weather, Fletcher and 2 hired hands, brothers Samuel and Jacob Whitaker, set to work on reinforcing the barn's crumbling foundation. The place was a steal, Fletcher would later tell Sheriff William Holloway in his official statement. Everyone in town acted strange when I mentioned buying it, but nobody would say why. I figured maybe old man Caldwell had died there or something superstitious like that. Wish someone had just told me the truth. The Caldwell farm had stood empty for nearly 7 years following the unexplained disappearance of Elizabeth Caldwell, age 44, and her daughter Margaret, age 17, in the summer of 1896. Their disappearance had generated significant attention throughout Henderson County at the time, particularly due to the prominence of Elizabeth's late husband, Judge Thomas Caldwell, who had died 3 years prior to their vanishing. From the Evansville Courier, June 28, 1896, widow and daughter missing from rural homestead. The Henderson County Sheriff's Department has launched an investigation into the disappearance of Mrs. Elizabeth Caldwell, widow of the late Judge Thomas Caldwell, and her daughter, Miss Margaret Caldwell. Neighbors reported no activity at the Caldwell farm for nearly 2 weeks before alerting authorities. Initial investigation reveals no signs of struggle, though personal belongings remain in the home. Anyone with information regarding their whereabouts is urged to contact sheriff's deputies immediately. The case had gone cold almost immediately, with no evidence of foul play and reports from neighbors that Elizabeth had grown increasingly reclusive following her husband's death. Many in the community speculated that the widow had simply decided to relocate, perhaps to join relatives in another state. The farm was eventually reclaimed by the county for unpaid taxes after 7 years of abandonment. What Fletcher and the Whitaker brothers discovered beneath the barn's earthen floor would forever change the narrative surrounding the Caldwell women's disappearance. We'd been digging near the northwest corner, trying to shore up that section where the foundation stones had started to sink, Samuel Whitaker, 26, recounted to Deputy Marshal Reynolds. Jacob's shovel hit something solid about 4 feet down. We thought it was bedrock at first, but it sounded hollow. When we cleared away more dirt, we saw it was some kind of wooden structure, like a box or crate, but big. The men had uncovered what appeared to be a large wooden container, approximately 8 feet long by 4 feet wide, buried beneath the barn floor. Curiosity overwhelming caution, they pried open the crude lid. What they found defied immediate comprehension. 2 human forms, a woman and a younger female, lay side by side in the makeshift coffin. The bodies were completely encased in a thick layer of crystalline salt, their features discernible but distorted beneath the mineral coating. Most disturbing to the discoverers was the remarkable state of preservation. Despite having been buried for what would later be determined as nearly 7 years, the bodies showed minimal decomposition. Fletcher's statement continues, "I've butchered livestock my whole life and seen what happens to flesh after death. These didn't look right. They looked pickled, I guess you could say, like they'd been preserved somehow. The salt was packed all around them, inches thick. And their faces. Jesus help me. Their faces looked like they were screaming." Fletcher immediately sent Jacob Whitaker to town to alert Sheriff Holloway, while he and Samuel maintained watch over the grim discovery. By late afternoon, the sheriff had arrived with the county coroner, Dr. Howard Phillips, and 3 deputies. The scene was secured, and the bodies were carefully extracted from their salt-encrusted tomb. From Dr. Phillips' official report, dated March 21st, 1903, upon preliminary examination, the deceased appeared to be adult female, approximately 40 to 50 years of age, and adolescent female, approximately 15 to 20 years of age. Identification tentatively established as Elizabeth and Margaret Caldwell, based on physical characteristics and clothing remnants. Bodies remarkably preserved through what appears to be an intentional salt packing process, similar in principle to meat preservation techniques. Minimal decomposition observed despite estimated time since death of 6 to 7 years. Cause of death in both subjects appears to be asphyxiation, evidenced by petechial hemorrhaging in the conjunctiva and compressed tissues of the neck, consistent with ligature strangulation. Additional findings of note. Both victims' wrists and ankles show abrasions and contusions consistent with restraints. Evidence suggests both were alive when the salting process began. Further forensic examination required to establish conclusive timeline and full circumstances of death. The discovery sent shockwaves through Henderson County. Elizabeth Caldwell had been a respected, if somewhat private, figure in the community. The widow of a county judge who had presided over the local circuit court for nearly 20 years. Her daughter Margaret had been known as a bright, promising student at the local academy, before her mother withdrew her following Judge Caldwell's death. The investigation quickly focused on determining who had access to the property during the period when the Caldwell women disappeared. Sheriff Holloway assigned Deputy Reynolds to compile a list of individuals who had worked on or visited the farm in the months preceding June 1896. No one really visited the widow after the judge passed. Eleanor Hayes, 72, the Caldwells' nearest neighbor at a quarter-mile distance, told investigators. She let all the farmhands go, except for that strange fellow, Crawford. She said she and Margaret could manage with just his help. I never liked him, always had an odd look about him. Eyes that never seemed to blink enough. Jeremiah Crawford, 41 at the time of the women's disappearance, had been hired by Judge Caldwell 3 years before his death. Crawford had appeared in Henderson County with no known history or references, yet the judge had employed him as a general laborer on the farm. Following the judge's passing, Elizabeth had retained Crawford as the sole employee, dismissing the other workers who had maintained the property. Crawford wasn't from around here, Hayes continued in her statement. Some said he came from down Louisiana way, but no one knew for certain. After the judge died, he seemed to have some kind of hold over Elizabeth. She changed, became fearful, jumpy, stopped coming to church or market. Always said Crawford would fetch whatever they needed. Most alarming to investigators was the discovery that Crawford had disappeared at approximately the same time as the Caldwell women. His absence had generated little interest at the time, as most assumed he had simply moved on after his employers had left the area. With the grisly discovery of the bodies, Crawford immediately became the primary suspect. From Sheriff Holloway's case notes, March 23rd, 1903, issued all points bulletin for Jeremiah Crawford. Last seen, Henderson County, summer 1896. Approx 40 to 45 years of age now. Über11, dark hair lightly graying, scar across left cheek. Subject should be considered dangerous. Telegraph description to sheriff offices in adjoining counties and states. Disturbing evidence recovered from outbuilding at Caldwell Farm. Journals belonging to Crawford detail knowledge of salt preservation techniques allegedly learned in Louisiana bayou communities. Multiple references to maintaining purity and preserving beauty forever appears subject harbored unhealthy fixation on both Caldwell women, particularly the daughter. Dr. Phillips' further examination confirms victims were alive when salting process began. Salt crystals found in lung tissue. Death would have been excruciating and prolonged. As investigators delved deeper into the case, a more complex and disturbing picture began to emerge. Additional journals discovered hidden beneath floorboards in Crawford's quarters revealed that his relationship with the Caldwell family predated his employment at the farm. One journal entry dated October 12, 1892, read, "She doesn't recognize me. How could she after all these years? The judge suspects nothing. He believes the references I forged, so trusting, these Kentucky gentlemen. So, unlike the men of St. Bernard Parish who drove me away, Elizabeth looks just as she did when we were young, perhaps more beautiful with age. And Margaret, she has her mother's features, but improved upon, perfected. I watch them through their windows at night, sometimes planning, waiting further. Investigation by Sheriff Holloway revealed that a man matching Crawford's description had lived briefly in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, in the 1870s. There, a man named John Crawford had been suspected in the disappearance of 2 young women, but had fled before he could be questioned. More disturbingly, the bodies of those women had never been found, but rumors had circulated about Crawford's interest in preservation techniques used by some of the isolated bayou communities. Sheriff Holloway expanded his investigation, sending telegrams to law enforcement agencies across the southern states. Within 2 weeks, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Between 1874 and 1892, 5 separate jurisdictions reported cases involving missing women and a laborer or handyman, matching Crawford's description, who had abruptly disappeared around the same time. In none of these cases had bodies been recovered. The most significant breakthrough came from Thibodaux, Louisiana. There, in 1889, a local constable had investigated the disappearance of a widow and her 16-year-old daughter. Though the case remained unsolved, they had questioned a field hand who had worked on the family's small sugar plantation. The man, who called himself James Crawford, had vanished shortly after being interviewed. The constable had maintained detailed notes on the case, including a sketch of Crawford that bore striking resemblance to the man who would later work for the Caldwells. Most chilling was the discovery of a hidden room in the basement of the Caldwell home, overlooked in the initial investigation 7 years earlier. Behind a false wall in the root cellar, investigators found what appeared to be a workshop containing various tools, large quantities of salt, and detailed anatomical drawings. The space also held personal items belonging to women who were not Elizabeth or Margaret Caldwell, hairbrushes containing strands of different colored hair, jewelry, and small articles of clothing carefully preserved in salt-packed boxes. From Deputy Reynolds's supplemental report, April 2, 1903, the hidden room beneath the Caldwell house suggests Crawford's crimes extend beyond the 2 victims we've discovered. Items catalogued include 6 distinct hairbrushes with different hair colors, 12 pieces of jewelry, predominantly wedding bands and lockets, 9 handkerchiefs with different embroidered initials, and 3 partially preserved human fingers, all appearing to be female, stored in salt-packed jars. Most disturbing is the discovery of a leather-bound ledger containing what appears to be a methodical record of Crawford's victims. Entries date back to 1874, with the most recent being the Caldwell women in 1896, if accurate. This document suggests Crawford may be responsible for at least 17 disappearances across Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, and finally Kentucky. The ledger contains detailed notes on his preservation techniques, which evolved over time. Earlier entries mentioned difficulties with decomposition despite salt packing. Later entries reflect improved methods, culminating with the technique used on the Caldwell women. which Crawford described as his most successful preservation to date. Each entry includes disturbing personal observations about the victims. Typically focused on physical features, he found appealing and wished to preserve for eternity. The level of detail and methodical record-keeping suggests Crawford viewed his actions as some form of grotesque art or scientific endeavor rather than the heinous crimes they were. As word of the discovery spread, despite officials' attempts to control the flow of information, residents of Henderson County began reporting strange occurrences they had previously dismissed during the period when Crawford had worked for the Caldwells. Several townspeople recalled seeing Crawford purchasing large quantities of salt from the general store, far more than would be needed for normal farm use, even for meat preservation. Martha Simmons, who had worked at Danforth's general store in 1895 and 96, provided a written statement to Sheriff Holloway. Mr. Crawford would come in every few weeks and buy all the salt we had in stock, 50 or 60 pounds at a time. Mr. Danforth started ordering extra just for him. Once I asked what he needed so much for, and he got this strange look in his eye and said, "Preservation is an art that requires abundant materials." Made my skin crawl the way he said it. After the third or fourth time, Mr. Danforth told me to just get the salt ready when we saw Crawford coming and not to engage him in conversation. Said there was something not right about a man who talked about salt with such passion. Thomas Weldon, who delivered mail along the rural route that included the Caldwell farm, also came forward with troubling recollections. In the months before they disappeared, I rarely saw Mrs. Caldwell or her daughter. Crawford always met me at the road for their mail. The few times I did see the women, they seemed frightened, especially the daughter. Once when Crawford was elsewhere on the property, Margaret tried to hand me a note, but he returned suddenly and she pulled her hand back. I noticed bruising on her wrist. I mentioned it to the sheriff at the time, but nothing came of it. I've regretted not doing more ever since. By mid-April 1903, the investigation had expanded significantly. Sheriff Holloway coordinated with law enforcement across multiple states, sharing Crawford's description and details of his methodology. The case attracted attention from newspapers beyond Kentucky, with reporters from as far as Chicago arriving in Henderson County to cover the macabre story. From the Chicago Tribune, April 17, 1903, Salt Preservation Murders Shock Kentucky Community. A grisly discovery on a rural Kentucky farm has revealed what authorities believe may be the work of a serial murderer who preserved his victims in salt. The bodies of widow Elizabeth Caldwell and her daughter Margaret, missing since 1896, were found entombed beneath a barn floor, remarkably preserved through an elaborate salt-packing process. Authorities have identified Jeremiah Crawford, a farm laborer formerly employed by the victims, as the prime suspect. Evidence suggests Crawford may be responsible for similar disappearances across multiple southern states, dating back nearly 3 decades. This case represents one of the most disturbing criminal methodologies I've encountered in 23 years of law enforcement, stated Sheriff William Holloway of Henderson County. The level of calculation and the ritualistic nature of these crimes indicate a deeply disturbed individual who has likely been refining his techniques for years. Crawford remains at large, with a multi-state manhunt currently underway. As investigators continued to piece together Crawford's movements in the years since the Caldwell murders, a troubling realization emerged. Crawford had not simply fled after killing Elizabeth and Margaret. Evidence suggested he had remained in the area for some time, possibly watching as the initial investigation into their disappearance waned and was eventually abandoned. Several residents reported seeing a man matching Crawford's description, lingering near the abandoned Caldwell property as late as 1898, 2 full years after the women had vanished. Others recalled a strange drifter who had taken odd jobs in nearby communities before disappearing again. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony of Howard Jenkins, who had purchased a small parcel of land adjacent to the Caldwell farm in 1899. For the first few months after I built my cabin, I would sometimes wake to find footprints circling my property. At first, I thought it was kids, or maybe someone scoping to rob the place. Then one night I woke to the sound of digging. When I grabbed my shotgun and went to investigate, I caught a glimpse of a man shoveling near my well in the moonlight. When he saw me, he ran off into the woods. The next morning, I found my well water had a strange taste, salty like the ocean. I had to dig a new well on the other side of my property. I never reported it because it seemed too strange to explain. But after hearing about what they found at the Caldwell place, I wonder if he was trying to do something to my water supply. Jenkins' account prompted Sheriff Holloway to order testing of wells on properties surrounding the former Caldwell farm. 3 of the 5 tested showed abnormally high salt content, though not at levels dangerous to health. The implications were deeply unsettling. Crawford appeared to have been methodically contaminating the local water supply with salt, though whether as some form of signature, ritual, or simply a practical way to dispose of excess salt remained unclear. As spring turned to summer, the investigation continued, though Crawford remained elusive. Law enforcement agencies across 12 states had been alerted, but no confirmed sightings had been reported. The case had grown from a local murder investigation to what modern law enforcement would term a manhunt for a serial killer, though such terminology did not yet exist in 1903. Dr. Phillips completed his full examination of the Caldwell women's remains, producing a detailed report that both advanced the investigation and raised disturbing new questions. The level of preservation achieved through Crawford's salt-packing technique was unprecedented in forensic science of the era, preserving not only the bodies, but evidence that would normally have been lost to decomposition. From Dr. Phillips' final forensic report, May 12, 1903, examination confirms both victims were subjected to prolonged captivity before death. Evidence of malnutrition and restraint marks on wrists and ankles suggests they were held against their will for at least several weeks. The elder Caldwell shows signs of having been strangled on multiple occasions to the point of unconsciousness, but not death, likely as a means of control or torture. Most significantly, evidence indicates the younger Caldwell was alive and conscious when the salting process began. Residue patterns in the respiratory tract and defensive wounds on the hands suggest she was at least partially conscious as salt was packed around her body. The elder Caldwell appears to have been killed prior to preservation, possibly forced to witness her daughter's torture before her own death. Both bodies show evidence of systematic application of salt to living tissue over a period of days, beginning with the extremities and working inward, a process that would have caused excruciating pain. The methodology suggests Crawford had refined this technique through prior victims, supporting the theory that the Caldwells were not his first targets. Of particular note is the discovery of a foreign substance in both victims' remains, a compound containing salt mixed with various herbs and resins not native to Kentucky. Chemical analysis suggests similarities to preservation compounds used in certain Louisiana folk practices, though modified significantly. This supports the connection to Crawford's suspected Louisiana origins. As investigators delved deeper into Crawford's background, they uncovered evidence suggesting his obsession with preservation may have had roots in his early life experiences. A correspondent from the New Orleans Times-Picayune, assisting Sheriff Holloway's investigation, discovered records of a John Crawford who had worked as an assistant to an embalmer in New Orleans in the early 1870s. This Crawford had been dismissed after the funeral home owner discovered him conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers, attempting to improve upon standard embalming techniques of the era. Though never charged with a crime, he had been run out of New Orleans by the funeral director, who threatened to have him arrested if he remained in the city. Local records from St. Bernard Parish identified the same man as having later worked briefly for a salt mining operation along the Louisiana coast before being terminated for theft of product. Former co-workers described him as obsessively interested in the preservative properties of salt, often expounding on historical salt preservation techniques from ancient Egypt to modern meat curing methods. One particularly significant discovery came in the form of a damaged journal recovered from Crawford's hidden workshop beneath the Caldwell home. Water damage had rendered much of it illegible, but several passages remained intact, offering disturbing insight into his motivations. The ancient Egyptians understood what modern man has forgotten. They preserved not just the flesh, but the essence of beauty for eternity. Their pharaohs and queens defied time itself through proper preservation. I have improved upon their methods. Salt is the key, and not just any salt, but the right composition, the right application. The women I select have a quality that deserves preservation. Their beauty should not be allowed to decay like common flesh. Another passage, dated approximately 3 months before the Caldwell women's disappearance, read, "Elizabeth grows suspicious. Today, she questioned why the root cellar always smells of salt. I told her it was for preserving the winter vegetables, but she seemed unconvinced. Margaret, however, remains perfectly trusting, a pure specimen untouched by any man. Her preservation will be my masterwork. I have refined the formula with additions from the Bayou Healer's recipe. This time, there will be no discoloration, no shrinkage of tissue. She will remain perfect forever." The investigation took another turn when Sheriff Holloway received correspondence from a detective in Natchez, Mississippi, regarding a case from 1882. There, a widow and her daughter had disappeared from their home, with a salt cellar worker named James Crawford identified as a person of interest. Though the bodies were never found, the detective had preserved evidence, including a sketch of Crawford and notes on his strange behaviors. The Natchez detective wrote, "Your description of Jeremiah Crawford matches our suspect in every detail, down to the scar on his left cheek. In our case, Crawford had ingratiated himself with the widow Spencer for nearly a year before she and her daughter vanished. What drew my attention to your case was the detail about salt preservation. Though we never located the Spencer women, we did find a small outbuilding on their property that contained large quantities of salt and crude drawings depicting human anatomy with detailed notes on tissue preservation. Most disturbing was a journal we recovered in which Crawford wrote extensively about failed attempts at preservation and his determination to perfect the process. He specifically mentioned learning techniques from the old woman in the bayou who preserves more than just meat. I've enclosed copies of the relevant journal pages and our original case notes, which may assist your investigation. Have you ever wondered what secrets might lie beneath the soil of old family farms across America? How many horrors remain undiscovered, preserved in darkness until chance or fate brings them to light? As the investigation into the Caldwell murders continued through the summer of 1903, a broader and more disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that suggested Jeremiah Crawford's activities extended far beyond Henderson County. By June, Sheriff Holloway had compiled reports from 7 different jurisdictions across 4 states, each describing cases bearing striking similarities to the Caldwell murders. The victims were invariably a widow and her daughter, typically living in rural isolation, and in each case, a man matching Crawford's description had been employed on their property before their disappearance. I believe we're dealing with a predator who has refined his methodology over decades, Sheriff Holloway wrote in a confidential memorandum to the Kentucky State Attorney's Office. Crawford appears to target specifically widow-daughter pairs, insinuates himself into their lives as a trusted employee, and then isolates them from the community before they vanish. The Caldwells are the only victims we've recovered, but based on evidence from his journals and corresponding cases in other jurisdictions, I estimate he may be responsible for as many as 20 such disappearances since 1874. the recovery of additional journals from Crawford's quarters at the Caldwell farm provided investigators with disturbing insight into his selection process and methodology. One passage dated March 1895 read, "I first saw them at Judge Caldwell's funeral. Elizabeth, still beautiful despite her grief, and Margaret, so perfect, so pure at 15. The judge had been a fool who never appreciated what he possessed. I knew immediately they were the ones I had been searching for since leaving Natchez. Perfect specimens, the mother to remind me of what I lost so long ago, and the daughter to preserve as she stands on the precipice of womanhood. Before time can begin its cruel work of destruction." Dr. Howard Phillips, working with a chemist from Louisville, continued analyzing the preservation compound found on the Caldwell bodies. Their findings suggested Crawford had developed a sophisticated understanding of tissue preservation that in some ways exceeded contemporary medical knowledge. From Dr. Phillips' research notes, June 19, 1903, the preservation compound contains not only sodium chloride, but a complex mixture including nitrates, various plant alkaloids, and what appears to be a resin, similar to that used in some Egyptian mummification practices. The sophistication of the formula suggests Crawford has been experimenting and refining his techniques for years, likely through trial and error with multiple victims. Most disturbing is the evidence that Crawford had developed methods to preserve not just dead tissue, but to begin the preservation process on living subjects. The compound contains components that would numb the skin while simultaneously beginning the desiccation process. Crawford appears to have started with the extremities, fingers, our toes, ears, working inward as the victim remained conscious, effectively preserving them alive inch by inch. As news of the case spread, despite efforts to contain the more gruesome details, public fascination with the Salt Widow case, as newspapers had dubbed it, grew. Reporters descended on Henderson County, and locals reported strangers arriving to catch a glimpse of the Caldwell farm, now considered a macabre landmark. Sheriff Holloway, concerned about contamination of evidence and the ghoulish tourism developing around the case, posted deputies at the property and issued public statements condemning the morbid interest. "This is not some dime novel mystery or carnival attraction," he told the Henderson Gleaner in a July interview. "Two women suffered unimaginable horrors at the hands of a depraved individual who remains at large. Their memory deserves respect, not sensationalism. Furthermore, public interference could compromise our ongoing investigation and the multi-state manhunt for Jeremiah Crawford." Despite the sheriff's efforts, the case captured the public imagination, particularly after several national newspapers published illustrated accounts of the Kentucky Salt murders. The lurid coverage focused primarily on the preservation aspects of the case, often with wildly inaccurate depictions of the victims and speculative accounts of Crawford's methods. The investigation took an unexpected turn in late July, when a letter arrived at the Henderson County Sheriff's Office. The handwriting matched that found in Crawford's journals. "Sheriff Holloway, you have disturbed my greatest work. The Caldwell women were my masterpiece, perfectly preserved for eternity. You should have left them in their salt tomb where they belonged. Do not think you are hunting me. I am watching you. I have been among you since you made your discovery. Your deputies passed me on the street just yesterday, tipped their hats to me in greeting. The preservation continues. Even now, I have selected new subjects more worthy than the Caldwells." Salt calls to salt. The great work continues. JC Forensic Analysis confirmed the letter had been written on paper stock sold at the Henderson General Store, suggesting Crawford may indeed have returned to the area. Sheriff Holloway immediately increased patrols and issued a public warning for residents to report any suspicious persons, particularly those showing interest in the case or attempting to purchase large quantities of salt. The most significant break in the ongoing manhunt came in early August when a railroad station master in Morganfield, Kentucky, approximately 30 miles from Henderson, reported an encounter with a man he believed to be Crawford. The man had purchased a ticket to Cairo, Illinois, and had been carrying a large trunk, which he was reluctant to let out of his sight. When questioned about its contents, the man had become agitated and claimed it contained family heirlooms of a delicate nature. He matched the description in every detail, Station Master Willard Peterson told investigators. Around 50 years old, graying dark hair, scar across the left cheek. What struck me was how he kept touching his trunk, almost caressing it. Said he was taking his precious collection somewhere safe. After he left, I noticed a white residue on the bench where he'd set the trunk down. Looked and felt like salt. Authorities in Cairo were alerted. But by the time the train arrived, the man matching Crawford's description had vanished, having apparently disembarked at a small stop along the route. The trunk was never located. As August progressed, reports of Crawford sightings increased across Kentucky and neighboring states, though none could be definitively confirmed. The investigation began to stall as leads grew cold and resources stretched thin. Sheriff Holloway, however, remained committed to capturing Crawford, convinced the killer would eventually make a mistake. That mistake came on September 2nd, 1903, when a general store owner in Smithland, Kentucky, reported a man purchasing 50 pounds of salt along with various herbs and chemicals. The storekeeper, having read about the Caldwell case in newspapers, became suspicious and alerted local authorities after the man's departure. Constable James Ridley of Livingston County located the suspect at a small rented cabin near the Cumberland River. When confronted, the man, positively identified as Jeremiah Crawford, attempted to flee but was apprehended after a brief pursuit. The cabin, when searched, revealed Crawford had established another workshop similar to the one found beneath the Caldwell home. Most disturbing was the discovery of a partially completed salt preservation enclosure, suggesting he had been preparing for new victims. From Constable Ridley's report to Sheriff Holloway, September 3rd, 1903, subject was taken into custody at approximately 4:15 p.m. after brief resistance. Search of premises revealed evidence consistent with preparation for activities similar to those committed at the Caldwell property. Located in the root cellar was a wooden box lined with zinc, approximately human-sized, half-filled with layered salt compound. Also recovered were journals continuing those found at the Caldwell farm, detailing his activities since fleeing Henderson County. Most disturbing was a crude map marking locations across Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, and Illinois, with dates and initials, possibly indicating past or intended victims. Subject refuses to explain the markings, but smiles when questioned about them. Crawford is currently held in the Livingston County Jail, awaiting transfer to Henderson County. Recommend heightened security as subject has made statements suggesting he has followers who understand the importance of preservation. Crawford was transferred to Henderson County on September 5th under heavy guard. Upon arrival, he was interviewed by Sheriff Holloway and Dr. Phillips, though he initially refused to answer questions directly, instead making cryptic statements about his great work and how others would continue in his absence. The most coherent statement came when Dr. Phillips asked about his preservation techniques. "The salt is merely a vessel," Crawford explained with unsettling clarity. The Egyptians understood this. Preservation is not just about preventing decay, but about capturing essence. "The women I preserved, their beauty remains intact beneath the crystal coating. They will outlast all of us. In 1,000 years, someone will uncover my works and understand the gift I've given to eternity." When asked directly about the Caldwell women and other potential victims, Crawford smiled and said simply, "The salt remembers what was entrusted to it. There are others still waiting to be found. The great work continues through those who have learned from me." This statement prompted Sheriff Holloway to question whether Crawford had accomplices, individuals he had taught his methodology, who might continue his activities. Though Crawford would not elaborate further, investigators took the threat seriously, reviewing his known movements for evidence of extended contact with others who might have fallen under his influence. As September progressed, Crawford remained in custody awaiting trial, though his behavior became increasingly erratic. He refused food unless it was heavily salted and spent hours writing in journals provided at his request, filling pages with detailed drawings of preservation techniques and rambling philosophical justifications for his actions. On September 28th, guards discovered Crawford unresponsive in his cell. Despite Dr. Phillips's immediate attention, he was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. The cause, self-induced salt poisoning. Somehow Crawford had managed to smuggle and consume nearly a pound of salt, leading to fatal hypernatremia. A final journal entry, dated the night of his death, read simply, "I join my preserved beauties in eternity. Those I have taught will continue." Salt calls to salt. The great work continues.